Good morning, everybody. How are you doing today? Welcome to Grow the Info, where we like to spread information and help it proliferate. And I like to give you the sources and the background information to back up everything that you're trying to inform people on. So, this hearing is going on right now regarding biometrics and facial recognition being used by Department of Homeland Security. Not that long ago, I had done a stream on some immigration news, and in that, I pointed out that facial recognition is something that they're going to be implementing more and more when it comes to letting immigrants in, or even just people coming to visit or anything. I guess I'll talk more about it after the hearing because it's already started, and I hope that this is working. I've had a lot of issues with the internet. It was just telling me a second ago that live streaming isn't available right now. I don't know. So we're going to go ahead and play this hearing. There are no white papers going along with it. There is a witness list though, and I didn't put that in the description box. I'm sorry, you guys. I'm having some serious technical issues this morning. So hopefully I can stream this whole hearing. Thank you so much for joining, and you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at GrowTheInfo, and you can check out our website, growtheinfo.com, for all kinds of good resources and information. So thank you guys so much for watching. Let's go ahead and watch this, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it after the hearing.
The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. Let me say at the outset, a number of our members are still en route from the prayer breakfast this morning, and they will join us accordingly, the ranking member being one of them. The committee is meeting today to receive testimony on the Department of Homeland Security's use of facial recognition and other biometric technologies. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Good morning. The committee is meeting today to continue examining the Department of Homeland Security's use of facial recognition technology. The committee held part one of this hearing in July of last year after news that the department was expanding its use of facial recognition for varying purposes, such as confirming the identity of travelers, including U.S. citizens. As facial recognition technology has advanced, it has become the chosen form of biometric technology used by the government and industry. I want to reiterate that I'm not wholly opposed to the use of facial recognition technology, as I recognize that it can be a valuable tool to the Homeland Security and serve as a facilitation tool for the department's varying missions. But I remain deeply concerned about privacy, transparency, data security, and the accuracy of this technology, and want to ensure those concerns are addressed before the department deploys it any further. Last July, I, along with other members of this committee, shared these concerns at our hearings and left this room with more questions than answers. In December 2019, the National Institute for Standards and Technology published a report that confirmed age, gender, and racial bias in facial recognition algorithms. NIST, for example, found that depending on the algorithm, African American and Asian American faces were misidentified 10 to 100 times more than white faces. Although CBP touts that the match rate for this facial recognition system is over 98%, it is my understanding that NIST did not test CBP's current algorithm for its December 2019 report. Moreover, CBP's figures do not account for images of travelers who could not be captured due to a variety of factors, such as lighting or skin tone, likely making the actual match rate significantly lower. These findings continue to suggest that some of this technology is not really ready for prime time and requires further testing before widespread deployment. Misidentifying even a relative small percentage of the traveling public could affect thousands of passengers annually and likely would have a disproportionate effect on certain individuals. This is unacceptable. Data security also remains an important concern. Last year, a CBP contractor experienced a significant data breach, which included traveler images being stolen. We look forward to hearing more about these lessons CBP learned from this incident and the steps that it takes to ensure that biometric data is kept safe. Transparency continues to be key. The American people deserve to know how the department is collecting facial recognition data and whether the department is in fact safeguarding their rights when deploying such technology. That is why we're here 7 months later to continue our oversight. I'm pleased that we again have witnesses from CBP and NIST before us to provide us with an update and answer our questions. We'll also have testimony from DHS's Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. This office is charged with ensuring the protection of our civil rights and civil liberties as it relates to the department's activities. No easy task, especially these days. Be assured that under my leadership, this committee will continue to hold the department accountable for treating all Americans equitably and ensuring that our rights are protected. I look forward to a robust discussion with all the witnesses, and I thank the members for joining us today. I welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Mr. John Wagner, currently serves as the Deputy Executive Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Field Operations, U.S. Customs and Border Protection. In his current role, he oversees nearly 30,000 federal employees and manages programs related to immigration, customs, and commercial trade-related CBP missions. Mr. Peter Minna is a Deputy Officer for Program and Compliance at the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. Mr. Minna previously served as Chief of the Labor and Employment Law Division for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Dr. Charles Romine is the Director of Information Technology Laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. In this position, he oversees a research program that focuses on testing and interoperability, security, usability, and reliability of information systems. Without objections, the witness's full statement will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Wagner.
Morning. Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on behalf of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to discuss the recent NIST report with you today. Since CBP is using an algorithm from one of the highest performing vendors identified in the report, we're confident that our results are corroborated with the findings of this report. More specifically, the report indicates while there's a wide range of performance of the 189 different algorithms that NIST reviewed, the highest performing algorithms had minimal to undetectable levels of demographic-based error rates. The report also highlights some of the operational variables that impact error rates, such as gallery size, photo age, photo quality, numbers of photos of each subject in the gallery, camera quality, lighting, human behavior factors, all influence the accuracy of an algorithm. And that's why CBP has carefully constructed the operational variables in the deployment of the technology to ensure we can attain the highest levels of match rates, which remain in the 97 to 98% range. And one important note is that NIST did not test the specific CBP operational construct to measure the additional impact these variables may have, which is why we've recently entered into an MOU with NIST to evaluate our specific data. But as we build out the congressionally mandated biometric-based entry-exit system, we're creating a system that not only meets the security mandate, but also in a way that is cost-effective, feasible, and facilitative for international travelers. Identity requirements are not new when crossing the border or taking an international flight. Several existing laws and regulations require travelers to establish their identity and citizenship when entering and departing the United States. CBP employs biographic and biometric-based procedures to inspect the travel documents presented by individuals, to verify the authenticity of the document, and determine if it belongs to the actual person presenting it. Again, these are not new requirements. The use of facial comparison technology simply automates a process that is often done manually today. The shortcomings of human manual review in making facial comparisons are well documented. Humans are prone to fatigue, sometimes have biases they may not even realize, to include own race and gender biases. Fingerprint biometrics have also documented gaps in their performance. There's a small percentage of people that we see we cannot capture fingerprints from. And there are studies that document this as well as demographic correlations, most notably based on age. And we're all well aware of the issues of common names when we rely on a biographic-based vetting scheme alone. So no one system by itself is perfect. However, since the United States, along with many other countries, put a digital photograph into the electronic chip on a passport, it would seem to make prudent sense that the technology may be useful in determination of the rightful document holder. It's more difficult today to forge or alter a legitimate passport, as security features are more stronger than they were 10 to 15 years ago, but we're still vulnerable to a person using a legitimate document, particularly a U.S. travel document, that is real but belongs to someone else. Using facial comparison technology, to date, we've identified 252 imposters to include people using 75 genuine U.S. travel documents. And privacy continues to be integral to our biometric mission. CBP is compliant with the terms of the Privacy Act of 1974 as amended, the E-Government Act of 2002, the Homeland Security Act of 2002, the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1995, and departmental policies that govern the collection, use, and maintenance of personally identifiable information. CBP recently published updates to the appendices in the Privacy Impact Assessment covering this program, and systems of record notices have been published on the databases to process and store the information. We've met 3 times with representatives of the privacy advocacy community, as well as discussions with the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board and the DHS Privacy and Integrity Advisory Committee. In November, CBP submitted to the Office of Management and Budget a rulemaking that would solicit public comments on the proposed regulatory updates and amendments to the federal regulations. And one final note is that our private sector partners, the airlines and the airports, must agree to documented specific CBP business requirements if they are submitting to photographs to CBP as part of this process. These requirements include a provision that images must be deleted after they're transmitted to CBP and may not be retained by the private stakeholder. After the devastating attacks of September 11th, we as a nation asked, how can we make sure this never happens again? As part of that answer, the 9/11 Commission report recommended that DHS should complete as quickly as possible a biometric entry-exit screening system, and that it was, quote unquote, an essential investment in national security. CBP is answering that call and carrying out the duties Congress has given us by continuing to strengthen its biometric efforts along the travel continuum and verifying that people are who they say they are. So thank you for the opportunity to appear today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Mina to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Rogers, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Department of Homeland Security's use of facial recognition technology. DHS's commitment to non-discrimination in law enforcement and screening activities remain an important cornerstone of our daily work to secure the homeland. I would like to make 3 overarching points in my testimony today. First, the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties has been and continues to be engaged with the DHS operational components to ensure use of facial recognition technology is consistent with civil rights and civil liberties, law and policy. Second, operators, researchers, and civil rights policymakers must work together to prevent algorithms from leading to impermissible biases in the use of facial recognition technology. And third, facial recognition technology can serve as an important tool to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the department's public protection mission, as well as the facilitation of lawful travel. But it is vital that these programs utilize technology in a way that safeguards our constitutional rights and values. Now, to achieve these 3 points, CRCL, 1, influences DHS policies and programs throughout their life cycle. 2, engages with department offices and components in the development of new policies and programs to ensure that protection of civil rights and civil liberties are fully integrated into their foundations. 3, monitors operational execution and engages with stakeholders in order to provide feedback regarding the impacts and consequences of policies and programs. And fourth and finally, we investigate complaints and make recommendations to DHS components, such as complaints including allegations of racial profiling or other impermissible bias. CRCL recognizes the potential risks of impermissible bias in facial recognition algorithms, as previously raised by this committee, and supports rigorous testing and evaluation of algorithms used in facial recognition systems to identify and mitigate impermissible bias. CRCL will continue to support the collaborative relationship between the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the DHS Science Technology Directorate, the DHS Office of Biometric and Identity Management, and DHS components, including U.S. Customs and Border Protection, to that end. In carrying out its mission, CRCL advises DHS components and department offices by participating in enterprise-level groups working on biometric and facial recognition issues. Further, CRCL directly engages with DHS components. For example, CRCL has regularly engaged CBP on the implementation of facial recognition technology in its biometric entry and exit program. In particular, CRCL advised on policy and implementation of appropriate accommodations for individuals wearing religious headwear, for individuals with a sincere religious objection to being photographed, and for individuals who may have a significant injury or disability, and for whom taking photographs may present challenges or not be possible. As DHS's facial recognition programs mature and evolve, CRCL will be collaborating directly with CBP, S&T, and OBIM to address potential civil rights and civil liberties impacts. Further, CRCL will engage communities with CBP and DHS S&T to both inform the public regarding CBP's facial recognition programs and address potential concerns. Finally, we will continue to evaluate any potential alleged violations of civil rights or civil liberties in order to further inform our policy advice and strengthen DHS's facial recognition programs. CRCL understands that successful and appropriate facial recognition technology requires ongoing oversight and quality assurance, initial validation and regular revalidation, and a close relationship between the users and oversight offices. In this way, it can be developed to work properly and without impermissible bias when it achieves initial operating capability and then continually throughout its entire project lifecycle. At the same time, we will need to work with the operational components to ensure that policies and practices evolve so that the human part of the equation, the users, are also focused on responsible deployment of this technology, working in a manner that prevents impermissible bias in DHS activities. Again, I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you also for your testimony. I now recognize Dr. Romaine to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Rogers, and members of the committee, I'm Chuck Romine, the Director of the Information Technology Laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, also known as NIST. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss NIST's role in standards and testing for facial recognition technology. In the areas of biometrics, NIST has been working with public and private sectors since the 1960s. Biometric technologies provide a means to establish or verify the identity of humans based upon one or more physical or behavioral characteristics. Face recognition technology compares an individual's facial features to available images for verification or identification purposes. NIST's work improves the accuracy, quality, usability, interoperability, and consistency of identity management systems and ensures that U.S. interests are represented in the international arena. NIST research has provided state-of-the-art technology benchmarks and guidance to industry and to U.S. government agencies that depend upon biometrics recognition technologies. NIST's Face Recognition Vendor Testing Program, or FRVT, provides technical guidance and scientific support for analysis and recommendations for utilization of face recognition technologies to various U.S. government and law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, DHS, CBP, and IARPA. The NIST FRVT Interagency Report 8280, released in December 2019, quantified the accuracy of face recognition algorithms for demographic groups defined by sex, age, and race, or country of birth, for both one-to-one and one-to-many identification search algorithms. It found empirical evidence for the existence of demographic differentials in face recognition algorithms that NIST evaluated. The report distinguishes between false positive and false negative errors and notes that the impacts of errors are application dependent. NIST conducted tests to quantify demographic differences for 189 face recognition algorithms from 99 developers using 4 collections of photographs with 18.27 million images of 8.49 million people. These images came from operational databases provided by the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI. I will first address one-to-one verification applications. Their false positive differentials are much larger than those related to false negative and exist across many of the algorithms tested. False positives might present a security concern to the system owner as they may allow access to imposters. Other findings are that false positives are higher in women than in men and are higher in the elderly and the young compared to middle-aged adults. Regarding race, we measured higher false positive rates in Asian and African American faces relative to those of Caucasians. There are also higher false positive rates in Native American, American Indian, Alaskan Indian, and Pacific Islanders. These effects apply to most algorithms, including those developed in Europe and the United States. However, a notable exception was for some algorithms developed in Asian countries. There was no such dramatic difference in false positives in one-to-one matching between Asian and Caucasian faces for the algorithms developed in Asia. While the NIST study did not explore the relationship between cause and effect, one possible connection and an area for research is the relationship between an algorithm's performance and the data used to train the algorithm itself. I'll now comment on one-to-many search algorithms. Again, the impact of errors is application dependent. False positives in one-to-many search are particularly important because the consequences could include false accusations. For most algorithms, the NIST study measured higher false positive rates in women, African Americans, and particularly in African American women. However, the study found that some one-to-many algorithms gave similar false positive rates across these specific demographics. Some of the most accurate algorithms fell into this group. This last point underscores one overall message of the report: different algorithms perform differently. Indeed, all of our FRVT reports note wide variations in recognition accuracy across algorithms, and an important result from the demographic study is that demographic effects are smaller with more accurate algorithms. NIST is proud of the positive impact it's had in the last 60 years on the evolution of biometrics capabilities. With NIST's extensive experience and broad expertise, both in its laboratories and in successful collaborations with the private sector and other government agencies, NIST is actively pursuing the standards and measurement research necessary to deploy interoperable, secure, reliable, and usable identity management systems. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on NIST's activities in facial recognition and identity management, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. I thank all the witnesses for that testimony. I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I now recognize myself for questions. Dr. Romain, we'll start off with you. Part of your NIST report was like next generation technology, as I understand, that CBP will use, or did you review existing technology?
We're not certain of that. We certainly intend to continue our investigations. The existence of the specific algorithms that we test, those algorithms are submitted to us by the vendors. We have no independent way to correlate whether those are the identical algorithms that are being used in the field.
Mm-hmm. So your part of what you said is how the technology is deployed depends on the application of the technology. Explain that a little more to the committee.
Certainly. Our approach is that the significant thing to be cognizant of is the risk associated with the deployment, and the studies that we do help to inform policymakers such as members of Congress as well as operators of these technologies about how to quantify those risks, at least for the algorithms themselves. The deployed systems have other characteristics associated with them that we don't test. We test only the algorithms currently. And the second point is that that risk that comes from the error rates associated with the algorithms is part of a much larger risk management that the operators have to undertake. For example, access to critical infrastructures, an access control system to critical infrastructures is different than access to a phone that you might have. The risks are different in those two cases.
Thank you. Mr. Wagner, can you share with the committee the extent that CBP goes to protect the information collected in this process?
Sure. So the photographs that are taken by one of our stakeholders' cameras, they're encrypted. They're transmitted securely to the CBP cloud infrastructure, where the gallery is positioned. Right. The pictures are templatized, which means they're turned into some type of mathematical structure. They cannot be reverse engineered, and they're matched up with the templatized photos that we've pre-staged in the gallery, and then just a response goes back, yes or no, with a unique identifier.
Thank you. So the comment that 2 to 3% of people who are misidentified, what is CBP doing to try to get that to zero?
Right, so it's not that they're misidentified, it just means we didn't match them to a picture in the gallery that we did have of them, so we should have matched them, and you're right, that should be at zero, and that's where we look at the operational variables, the camera, the picture quality, the human behaviors when the photo was taken, the lighting, those different types of, and then the age of the photo, and then what we've seen in the NIST report, your gallery size impacts your match rate, and I think NIST tested galleries up to 12 million size. We're comparing against a few thousand here at most, and then the numbers of photos we have of the particular individual can impact which one we match against, and then some of your match rates, and then the age of the photo. So if you had your passport taken at age 20 and you're now 29, and your face has changed in the dimensions, we're going to struggle to match against that, which is then compounded by poor lighting conditions or the person moving when the photo's taken, or a poorer quality photo.
Well, Mr. Mena, listen to what you just heard. How would have you all dealt with any complaints from citizens about this technology?
Mr. Chairman, we've received one complaint that references facial recognition technology. However, we have not seen a trend, and that's when we would actually, in fact, open an investigation in this matter. We are working, as I mentioned, on the policy side of the House, advising CBP directly. The other way in which we also hear from the community, as you may know, is through our community engagement roundtables around the country. And we have heard concerns in those forums about facial recognition technology, and those are concerns that we're using to inform our advice.
So can you provide the committee with where you have held those forums around the country?
Yes, absolutely. We have we do roundtables in about 18 cities, and not to say that these concerns have been raised in every single location, but certainly in some. And then again, we'll continue to have those discussions with CBP and with S&T in the future at future roundtables.
Thank you. Lastly, Mr. Wagner, I'm not sure you have information on this, but last month, Iranian and Lebanese nationals and individuals who traveled to Iran and Lebanon, most of whom were U.S. citizen or green card holders, were targeted, detained, and subjected to prolonged questioning of up to 12 hours at the Blaine area port of entry. I understand an internal CBP memo indicates people were also questioned based on their religion, which is completely unacceptable. I understand CBP has admitted to enormous mistakes in this incident. If you know, how did this situation happen, and what is CBP doing to ensure that it never happens again?
So There was no national directive or guidance that went out other than because of the things taking place in Iran, the concerns about retaliation, we put our field managers on alerts to be more vigilant about current events that are happening and work with your local, state, local, and federal counterparts and, really just be vigilant. There was some more prescriptive guidance that went out at the local level in Blaine, Washington, which we are reviewing right now because there's a lot of concerning things I think that we saw in the interpretation of that guidance and the management and oversight as that weekend was unfolding and people were being referred in for additional inspections and questioning. And there's some concerning points about the management engagement or lack thereof of what transpired. So there is an internal investigation that CBP is conducting. Civil Rights and Civil Liberties is conducting an investigation, and when we get the results of that, we'll then proceed, accordingly with depending on what those results say.
Mr. Minner, are you aware of that?
Yes, and we do, and as Mr. Wagner said, we do have an open investigation in this matter.
Okay, thank you. Ranking Member, you ready?
I'm ready, thank you.
Yield to Ranking Member for the opening statement.
Yeah, sorry for being late. We just got back from the National Prayer Breakfast. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After the tragic events of September 11th, Congress recognized that biometric systems are essential to our homeland security. Following the recommendation of the 9/11 Commission, Congress charged DHS with the creation of an automated biometric entry and exit system. Customs and Border Protection and the Transportation Security Administration have already demonstrated the capability of biometrics to improve security, facilitate travel, and better enforce existing immigration laws. Government and the private sector have made enormous strides in the accuracy, speed, and deployment of biometric systems. Biometric technologies of all types have seen improvements. These advances in facial recognition algorithms in particular are transformational. The National Institute of Standards and Technology is the leader in testing and evaluation for biometric technologies. Dr. Romine and his team have done incredible work to help Congress, DHS, and industry understand the capability of currently available algorithms. But I'm concerned that some of my colleagues have already jumped to the misleading conclusion that NIST report on facial recognition. Just hours after NIST released the 1,200 pages of technical data, the majority tweeted that this report shows facial recognition is even more unreliable and racially biased than we feared. If the majority had taken the time to read the full report before tweeting, they would have found that the real headline, NIST determined that facial recognition algorithm being adopted by DHS has no statistically detectable race or gender bias. In other words, NIST could find no statistical evidence that facial recognition algorithms that DHS is adopting contains racial bias. I hope that my colleagues will listen to Dr. Romine as he explains how the NIST report proves that race or gender bias is statistically undetectable in the most accurate algorithms. The reality is that facial recognition technologies can improve existing processes by reducing human error. These technologies are tools that cannot and will not replace the final judgment of CBP or TSA officers. Concerns regarding privacy and civil rights are well-intentioned, but these concerns can be fully addressed in how biometric systems are implemented by DHS. I look forward to hearing the steps that CRCL is taking to coordinate with CBP and to protect the privacy and civil rights of Americans. But as I have said before, halting all government biometric programs is not a solution. Doing so ignores the critical facts. The technology that DHS uses is not racially biased. It does not violate the civil rights of Americans. It is accurate, and most importantly, it does protect the homeland. I appreciate the chairman calling the hearing today. It's important for Congress to further educate itself on this issue. I look forward to getting the facts, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I wish you'd heard the testimony because there was some testimony we heard to the contrary of that.
I look forward to probing him on that.
All right, well, I recognize the gentleman for his questions.
But my statement is wrong, to get to the chairman's point. Anybody can jump at it.
I would never tell Congress they're wrong.
You're one of the few people that won't do that. Literally, I mean, To my understanding is there's no statistical evidence that there's racial bias. Is that an inaccurate statement?
Thank you for the question. In the highest performing algorithms for one-to-many matches, the highest performing algorithms, we saw undetectable, the bias, the demographic differentials that we were measuring, we say are undetectable in the report.
So what do you mean by undetectable?
What I mean by that is that in the testing that we undertook, there was no way to determine, let me back up and say, the idea of having absolutely zero false positives is a big challenge.
And did you test the NEC3 algorithm being used by DHS?
We tested algorithms from NEC. We have no independent way to verify that that is the specific algorithm that's being used by CBP. That would be something that CBP and NEC would have to attest to. From our perspective, the vendor provides us algorithms. They're black boxes that we test, just the performance of the algorithm that's submitted to us by the vendor.
Mr. Wagner, is CBP currently working to implement NEC3 algorithms?
Any what, I'm sorry?
NEC3 algorithms?
Yes, we are using an earlier version of NEC right now, and I believe we're testing NEC3, which is the version that was tested, and the plan is to use it next month in March to switch over, to upgrade basically to that one.
Okay, Dr. Romine, who can participate in the facial recognition vendor test? Is it accurate to say that some algorithms are far less accurate and sophisticated than others?
Yes, sir, that's correct. Anyone around the globe can participate. We have participants from industries, biometrics industries around the country, but also from universities and some experimental systems as well.
Great. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wagner, let's get clear. The C3, you don't have it operational anywhere in the country, right? You're testing it. That technology goes into being, you said next month?
The NEC3 algorithm
Right.
we plan to implement next month. The earlier version of it is operational now.
But the one we're talking about is not.
Correct.
Yeah. Dr. Romine, let's be clear. You mentioned that African Americans and Asians get misidentified.
In the highest performing algorithms, we don't see that to a statistical level of significance. For one-to-many algorithms, the identification algorithms. For the verification algorithms, we do see, the one-to-one algorithms, we do see evidence of demographic effects for African Americans, for Asians, and others.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Slotkins for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I think, thank you for clarifying that, because it was hard to understand from your testimony. So just to be clear, Dr. I'm sorry, can you pronounce your name? I want to pronounce it right. Romine.
Romine, yes.
Romine. Sorry, apologies.
That's quite all right.
So in a certain segment of these algorithms, there is some evidence that they have higher rates of mistakes for African Americans and Asians. Is that Asian Americans? Is that?
It is correct that most of the algorithms in the one-to-many that are submitted do exhibit those differentials. The highest performing ones in the one-to-many do not.
Okay, so some do and some do not. I'm just trying to clarify. Thank you all for being here. I'm from Michigan, so we have a long history of needing our CBP officers to protect us at the Detroit airport and all of our bridges and crossings. So can you help me understand, is this technology, Mr. Wagner, being used in any way at our bridge crossings in the northern border?
No, not at the bridge crossings.
Okay, but at the airport.
At the airport,
I know
yes.
at the airport. So while I recognize it seems to be a small number of times or of these programs where there's they've detected more problems with particularly African American women, I think were mentioned, and Asian Americans. Walk me through the process where it would be sort of you're an average citizen, you're from my district, you're an African-American woman. Let's say we employ this technology, and it shows a positive, right, a link. Just walk me through that process and how you would deal with that at the actual border for that actual citizen.
You would then just show your passport, which is what you do today, and a person would manually review it if you did not match.
And if they showed the passport, but the technology still showed a match, what does that officer do in that situation? If the machine is saying one thing and the passport is saying another?
We would go on the basis of the document we're presenting and which photograph we've identified you with or which identity we've identified you with.
Okay, and then that person would cross the border and go on with their I'm just asking
Yeah.
for the average person to
Yeah.
understand how this is being implemented.
What we're matching people against U.S. citizens is that passport photo.
Yep.
We have an electronic copy of that passport database. So
Excuse me just a minute. Staff, you all are being most disrespectful to the hearing. Please.
So when you're flying into the country, you pre-assemble a gallery of those photographs, and that's what we match you against. So on the officer's screen, they'll see the photograph, which should be also what's printed on your passport, which also should be on that electronic chip in your passport. We'll look at you and make sure you're all that same person. If it doesn't match against that, then we'll have to figure out why.
And when you figure out why, is that individual allowed to progress? You know, we go to Windsor to like see a concert, and we go to Canada quite often in Michigan, so.
It could be as simple as just looking at your passport document and saying, okay, that's you.
Okay.
And then we'll figure it out later what happened.
And then what happens with that data, right? So let's say a woman has gone to her concert in Canada. What happens to her data where it's flagged that she's matched against, falsely flagged that she's matched against someone who's done something wrong? What happens in the department to that information?
If you're a U.S. citizen, the new photograph we take is discarded after 12 hours. There's no need for us to keep the new photograph. There's a record of the transaction that you crossed the border. If there's some type of error in that, then our analysts would look at it and correct it, basically. If you've matched, which happens very often in a biographical sense, your name, date of birth to the wrong person, even though your biographic match is identical to someone else, that's where we can also use the facial recognition to help us distinguish between the people with the common names. And we can put notes in the system then to advise the officer to suppress that information from even appearing when we query your passport the next time.
And tell me how this technology, where you've been implementing it at different airports and different land borders, I understand in the South, tell me what are the results? How many people have you identified in a positive way that meant what needed to be identified? Tell me some statistics to help me to demonstrate the value of these programs.
Sure, it's 43.7 million people we've run through it to date at all the different locations, inbound, outbound, cruise ships, land border pedestrians. We have caught 252 imposters, people with legitimate travel documents belonging to someone else. I think 75 of those were U.S. travel documents. And remember, U.S. travel documents, the only biometric we have is that digitized photo that State Department has put on the electronic chip. There's no fingerprint record, there's no fingerprint requirement to get a U.S. passport. I'm not advocating for one, but there isn't one there, so the only biometric we have on a U.S. travel document is that digitized photograph. And that's a worldwide standard. And that chip is allowed to be opened by any country participating in that ICAO scheme. They can access the chip and pull off the digital photograph and then do some type of comparison to that.
So in my remaining time, tens of millions of people that you've used that have gone through this technology, how many, just tell me a little bit more about your stats. How many positive stories, how many negative hits?
So our match rate is about 97 to 98%. That 2 to 3% generally means we couldn't find that person in that pre-assembled gallery, meaning we didn't match against anything. We didn't match against the wrong person, we just didn't find a match of people traveling. There could be various environmental or operational reasons
How
why
many
that
were
might
false
happen.
positives?
I'm not aware of any,
Okay.
but there may be a small handful. I'm just not aware of any, but as we built this and tested it, we're just not seeing that.
I think my time has expired. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The 9/11 Commission recommended the use of biometrics for those entering and leaving the United States, and I believe that technology is our friend in stopping terrorists and bad actors from entering this country. And we've seen it time and time again. And my first question is, my understanding is that the entry-exit program, American citizens can't opt out of that program. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So there's no requirement that all Americans have to be subjected to this?
No, but people have to establish their identity.
Yeah.
Once we determine, either through manual review of the passport or by using the technology, they are a U.S. citizen, they're excluded from the biometric tracking requirement.
Right.
But they can opt out of having their picture taken to make that determination.
Yeah, just like we use with global entry. Most of my constituents love global entry. You know, I got the CLEAR program, as did Mr. Katko, associated with TSA, so you could put your fingerprints down and get to the head of the TSA pre-check line. These technology, I think, have made it easier for the traveling public, but also the great thing is it doesn't lie. Biometrics, it's you, and it's hard to fake that. And last Congress, we passed out of the committee my bill, the Biometric Identification Transnational Migration Alert Program, otherwise known as BitMap. Now, I know this is a nice program, not CBP, but it passed overwhelmingly in a bipartisan way on the floor, 272 to 119. And it reauthorized a successful program started under the Obama administration that Secretary Jay Johnson and I talked a great deal about. How can we use BitMap to identify when these people are coming into our hemisphere that they may change their names multiple times along the route to get to the United States, yet their facial recognition, their biometrics don't. Their names do, but not their biometrics. This has been, in my judgment, a very successful program in keeping terrorists, human traffickers, and bad actors out of this country. In fact, this program has enrolled over 155,000 encounters of persons of interest and 460 known and suspected terrorists, including arresting violent criminals and rapists involved in transnational criminal organizations. So, Mr. Wagner, can you comment on why that program is so valuable to the security of the United States and the American people?
Sure, it's critically important because, as you mentioned, people do change their biographic details. And, you know, most of our watch list searches are biographically based. But if we can identify people, especially people traveling via air, that we have national security concerns about and they're entering our hemisphere, if they're entering in Central or South America, we can work with our partners down there and establish on a biometric basis who that person is. So no matter what identity they show up in later, if they show up on the US-Mexico border, we can run the biometric confirmation to see, well, who were they when they first flew into the hemisphere? So it's critically important.
And the travel documents can change, and passports are stolen and manufactured.
Absolutely.
And that's not accurate, but the biometrics don't lie.
Correct. People change documents, steal documents, borrow documents, purchase documents. It's harder to alter them now, but the ability to get a legitimate document that, you know, looks like you, and if you can pass by the visual inspection of somebody glancing at the little 2x2 photograph on it, yeah, and that's where the risk is.
It's unfortunate the Senate, in its usual wisdom, did not pass this bill. They stalled a lot of legislation that the chairman and I, in a bipartisan way, passed last Congress, and that's unfortunate. I would hope we could pass this bill again this Congress, and I do think we have to look at civil liberties and privacy as well. But I do think this is an entry-exit as opt-out. It applies primarily to Americans who would want to opt in and foreign nationals, and BitMap applies really to foreign nationals themselves. And so I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, thanks for having this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member. I thank our expert witness who testified before us today. But it's time that we face the facts. Unregulated facial recognition is just not an option. We can debate and disagree about the exact situations where we should permit the use of facial recognition, but we should all agree that there's no situation where facial recognition should be used without safeguards against bias and protections for privacy. Right now, in terms of regulation, facial recognition is still in the Wild West. Meanwhile, facial recognition technologies are routinely misidentifying women and people of color. Although there are some promising applications for facial recognition, these benefits don't outweigh the risks of automating discrimination. We've seen what happens when technology is widely deployed before Congress can impose meaningful safeguards. So let us all look before we leap. Mr. Wagner, some of our staff have observed issues with facial recognition technology screening at airports. For example, we've seen passengers, and particularly darker-skinned passengers, it seems, not able to be matched due to poor lighting or other factors. Does CBP track how often its systems fail to capture photos of sufficient quality for matching?
We track the number of, well, we don't own all the cameras, so it's difficult for us to track what an airline, how many pictures they might be taking before they submit one to us for matching. Because in the departure environment, the airports or the airlines are the ones that own them. So we are tracking how many pictures we receive and what our match rates against them are.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the quality, because if the photo quality isn't good enough, the accuracy of the matching algorithm is irrelevant.
Absolutely. So we set a minimum
Right.
standard. The picture has to be of this quality before
But
it
do
even...
you track the numbers of photos that don't meet your standard? You said you have all these other partners that are taking photos. If
Right.
you're using their material, then now you're dealing with something that has become irrelevant. If you don't know what subset of those don't meet your quality control.
Well, we know the pictures that they transmit to us, whether or not they meet.
Right, but have you...
But we don't know how many attempts they've made.
Absolutely, and you don't know the quality. You don't know how much of that, what percentage of that doesn't meet your standard.
Well, we look at the number of passengers
Do
on
you know the percentage that doesn't meet your standard?
Not offhand, no.
Ah, okay. How does CBP plan to address these issues to ensure it can capture high-quality images of travelers for successful facial recognition screening?
Well, that's the partnership with NIST where we have a high-performing algorithm. Now we look at the operational variables to make that even more high-performing.
So what I would say to you is that then, until you've met that standard, you're not doing
what
the public
standard
a
is
service
that?
of quality control.
We're developing that standard.
Right. It is not developed, right? You're developing.
Not necessarily, no. I mean, what we're seeing, if we're matching at a 97 to 98% rate, we're getting...
Let me go on to another question. I understand, when you're in that 3%, it doesn't matter about the other.
We're not seeing demographic-based
Okay.
rates in that 3%. And that's what we've partnered with NIST to come in and help us understand that better, to
Very
make
well.
sure that that's the case.
Very well. I understand that since our last hearing, CBP completed operational testing of the biometric entry-exit systems at airports. The results indicated that the system accurately matched images when captured, but the rate of successfully capturing an image was significantly lower than expected, 80% compared to 97%. Most of these issues were attributed to airlines reverting to manually processing passengers to speed the boarding process. Are you aware of these findings?
Yes, and that's as we were developing the operational variables to look at, number one, does it even work, right? Can we make it work? Now we look at and we work with the airlines to not shut down their boarding. What is the ease of the application of the traveler engaging with
So
that?
quickly, what steps is CBP taking to work with airlines to increase image capture rates?
So one is publishing the regulation, which would then put the requirement onto the foreign national who has to comply with the biometric exit congressional mandate. Then we can work with the carriers to increase the the rate at which people
Here's
are
what,
taken.
can you provide our committee with those steps? That would be
Sure,
helpful.
absolutely.
Let me ask just quickly, because I've run out of time. Mr. Mina, you spoke in your testimony about impermissible bias. And I was just wondering, since you used that terminology, is the inverse, is that a part of your, is there something called permissible bias?
So let me, I think if I understand your question correctly, the reason why we use that term impermissible bias is because, as Mr. Reiner's talked about, Mr. Romine's talked about, there are lots of reasons why there may be a failure to cause a match, like, for example, lighting, environment, but our office is really focused on an error that is created based on a protected characteristic, like race or sex or age. And that, when I make that reference to impermissible bias, that's what I'm referring to.
So there's no bias that is permissible. In other words, if there is a quirk of some sort and you find it to be so inconsequential that it becomes part of your standard, that becomes permissible bias? I'm just trying to understand what you mean by impermissible bias.
Again, I think what I'm focusing on is, what is actually, prohibited by law that our office would look at, which is really based on those protected characteristics. Now, of course, obviously, CBP and folks across the department are trying to eliminate any bias based on any reason. However, in terms of what we do as a policy office, we are really focused on the potential for bias in those protected areas.
Very well. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you having this hearing. This is very important, and I think I commend all my colleagues for the probing questions because it's important. But I will make this general observation based on my time as a prosecutor. When I was first a prosecutor, DNA evidence was this weird science thing that no one really knew about. And as we went on, and as it got refined, and as it got better, it became a very potent tool, not just for law enforcement, but to exonerate people who were wrongly accused of crimes. And I see the biometric technology filling a similar role. It's going to help law enforcement, but it's also going to do a dramatically good thing to prevent misidentification of criminal conduct. And I'm heartened for that. So one of the things I'm heartened most about that I heard today was from Dr. Romine, that the highest performing algorithms have no statistical anomalies, if I understand that correctly. So that means that at some point those algorithms will get to the front lines, and I encourage you to get them to the front lines quickly. And I encourage Mr. Mina never to let your guard down and always follow any problems with these systems and make it better, because in the end, we're all going to benefit. And I trust my colleagues will ask other probing questions, so I have to ask something of Mr. Wagner that occurred yesterday that's very important to my constituents in general, but into New York State in particular. A letter was sent February 5th, 2020, which was yesterday, to New York State, saying why Homeland Security can no longer have New York driver's licenses as part of the formula for the Trusted Traveler Program. And that is because New York State, under the green light law, which they passed, forbids access by CBP and ICE to the New York driver databases. So could you briefly summarize for us, and I'll ask that this letter be incorporated into the record, Mr. Chairman, first of all? I ask this letter be incorporated into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Could you just briefly summarize the contents of this letter? Then I have a follow-up question for you.
Yeah, so my understanding is New York State, because of the law that they passed, without consultation, shut off the access to motor vehicle data, which included driver's license information, license plate registration, vehicle registration information. So in our operations, any of the work that we do where we would use that information to help validate an identity, an address, and a vehicle, the ownership of a vehicle, is impacted by not being able to do that directly. And the breadth of our mission goes way beyond, I think, what the law says about immigration enforcement, and you're impacting the customs mission, the national security mission, and all the other areas in which we operate.
And is there any other state in the country that is having this problem with customs?
We've worked some other agreements with other states to continue to access the data for the work that we do.
So am I to understand that New York State's the only one who forbids Customs and Border Protection as well as ICE to have access to their driver databases?
Yes, it's the only one I'm familiar with right now.
Even California?
California, we have a separate agreement with where we continue to access their information.
Now, I just want to note further, from as long as we have a couple of minutes here, some of the things that are in the letter. Tell me if this is correct. On a daily basis, ICE uses New York DMV data in an effort to combat transnational gangs, narcotic smuggling, human smuggling and trafficking, trafficking of weapons and other contraband, child exploitation, exploitation of sensitive technology, fraud, and identity theft. And is it fair to say that by not having access to this database, it hampers those investigations at times?
Sure, any law enforcement practice where you would normally use that information, yeah, would be impacted.
Okay. I yield back to panel. It's my time.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the young lady from New York, Ms. Rice, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let's continue, Mr. Wagner, if we can, on talking about what happened with New York. Was CBP made aware of the policy before the acting secretary's announcement on Fox News?
Yes.
So you were aware of it. No notification was made to Congress about blocking access to these federal programs for New Yorkers?
I don't know.
Okay, well, there was none. So personally, we at my office has already received an influx of new questions about this policy, literally overnight. 50 to 80,000 New York state residents are affected who have pending global entry enrollment applications or renewals. This is going to have an enormous impact on people, many of whom entered into this program because their jobs require them to travel internationally. So what do you plan to do about all those people who are going to be impacted?
Well, without the ability to help validate their identity through the...
You have their fingerprints.
Yeah, but if they haven't been arrested, the fingerprints don't tell us anything.
Well,
What would the fingerprints tell you if you haven't been
but
arrested?
what are you trying to find out is my point.
Trying to validate their address, where they live, their residency. These are things important to us as we establish that low-risk, trusted traveler status that we afford people in that program. Without the ability to do that, how would we do that? So New York State shut off without consultation our access to that information in December. How would we continue to operate and validate who people are?
Well, going forward, what about the people who already have it? I have global entry.
So
So when I go to renew it, I'm not going to be able to do that.
correct.
And yet here I am, a sitting congresswoman with global entry. So to me, okay, I understand the distinction that you're making. There are at least 15 other states. You're saying that you have individual agreements with all of them where they do not block access to this database. 15 other states who have a global...
I'm not aware of any other state blocking our access to that information.
Okay, so I would like you, we're going to follow up. I'm going to follow up directly with you because there are at least 15 other states that allow undocumented people to get driver's licenses. Okay? And I would
I'm not
like...
aware of them blocking our information.
Okay, so you not being aware is not a sufficient answer because there could be other states that do. And it seems to me that this is, once again, an attempt by this administration, specifically Donald Trump, who formerly was a New Yorker, to punish New York. Okay? So you and I are going to follow up on this, and I appreciate you trying to answer these questions, but we need more information. And I appreciate your attempt to answer these questions, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wagner, just for the record, can a person have global entry without driver's license?
Yes, I believe so.
So I'm trying to figure out how you're going to cancel all these people, and some of them don't even drive, deny them.
Well, it's a New York State identification.
But they have passports.
Validation of that information.
But they have a passport. They have a passport.
But how do we validate the address of where they live?
My driver's license has a post office box. So, I mean, I'm just trying to figure out Are you being
Again,
punitive?
why is the information blocked for this purpose then?
Well, I don't know. I'm saying, I'm using, why would you cancel it?
Okay, but why would New
it's-
York State block the information for this purpose?
But is it for identification or security?
Both.
But you can prove it with other documents. I mean, that's what I'm trying to figure. Well, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield 1 minute to my colleague, Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. And I just want a quick follow-up question with my colleague, and it's a quite simple one, really. First of all, it's clear that it hampers investigations with ICE. It's clear that it hampers the ability to get certain identification information from that are available in drivers' DMV databases in New York State. I just want to make sure it's clear. My colleague from New York, Ms. Rice, mentioned that there's many other states that have possible, like allowing illegal aliens to get driver's licenses. That's not the issue. The issue is there any other state in the United States of America that completely blocks Customs and Border Protection and ICE's access to DMV records?
I don't believe so.
Okay, so in my opinion, and I have an immense amount of respect for my colleague from New York, I do not believe this is a political exercise. All New York would have to do is enter into a similar agreement that those other 15 states have entered into with Customs and Border Protection and ICE, where they simply verify that they won't use it for immigration enforcement purposes. They'll use it for law enforcement purposes and for global entry and those types of things. Is that correct? You can do that?
I think that's a discussion we would have with the state.
Okay, and you've done it with other states?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
I thank my colleague. Just to follow up on the New York question, because it's a fascinating topic. Are you aware of negotiations or communications prior to the New York legislative body passing this law with Customs and Border Protection? Were we out front with this communication at all?
Our access,
Seemed to me like they should have known before they passed the law this was going to happen.
right, our access was just turned off one day in December, and our officers and agents in the fields called in and said, you know, what happened to our access? It's
So you're
gone.
saying that there's, as far as you know, and you can certainly advise if you do not know, I have no way of knowing, but as far as you know, sir, was there any ongoing communications during the course of the development of this legislation in the state of New York with the law enforcement agencies like Customs and Border Protection and ICE?
I don't know, not aware of any.
Well, one would hope that there was. Dr. Romaine, you mentioned blind box testing. Would you clarify that means that as your products are tested through NIST, your facial recognition products provided by vendors, that they're tested without your knowledge of who the vendor is? You're strictly looking at the results of the algorithm themselves.
So when I use the phrase black box testing, what I mean is that we don't have any insight into the characteristics of the algorithm itself. We publish an API, an application program.
You know the identity of the vendor?
It's self-identified. The vendor.
It's self-identified as you're studying
That's correct.
the
And so
product
we do-
itself.
we do
Okay,
track
just to clarify that. Now, can any vendor submit an algorithm to NIST for testing?
Yes, sir.
And the process by submitting that product is standardized?
It is, sir.
All right. And the top performing algorithms like Customs and Border Protection uses, is there a wide variance between what you're referring to as the top performing algorithms and, say, academic projects perhaps submitted for testing?
Yes, sir. There's a wide variance in the performance of algorithms at the top of.
So in your scientific assessment
Yes, sir.
of NIST testing and evaluation of facial recognition technologies, would you say that what we're referring to as the top performing algorithms that are being used by Customs and Border Protection are far and beyond some of the common products that are presented to you?
The top performing algorithms are significantly better in their error.
Can you confirm for this committee, sir, that that it is indeed the top performing algorithms at this point that's being used by our federal law enforcement agencies?
Sir, I have no way to independently verify that. That would be something that
But
the
we just
federal-
said that Customs and Border Protection is using the top. I want to confirm.
I didn't say that.
Can you confirm that, good sir?
We're using, not the algorithm they tested, but we're using the previous version of it, and we're upgrading to the version that they tested next month. So yes, we're using a high-performing
Going to the
vendor.
next iPhone? All right, I think that vaguely answered that
Gentlemen.
question, and my time has expired. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's see. Let me ask, who and where is all this facial recognition data stored? And please describe under what specific circumstances this data is allowed to be shared or used and or transferred if that is the case.
We are using, as a database, travel document databases. So these are photographs collected by the U.S. government for the purposes of putting on a travel document, like a U.S. passport or a U.S. visa that's issued to a foreign national, or a photograph that a foreign national, when they arrive in the United States, like under the visa waiver program, we would take their photograph or read the photograph from the chip in their passport and store that. That's what forms the baseline gallery that we match against. Now, new photographs we take of a person, U.S. citizen, if we match it to a U.S. travel, a U.S. passport, or a U.S. identity, those photos are discarded, okay, after 12 hours, just for some system work. If you're a foreign national, that goes over to a system called ident that DHS runs, where they're stored under the protocols or the systems of record notice of the data retention period of that, which I believe is 75 years.
Okay, all right. And to follow up with that, you know, we're living in an age where everything is being hacked. What type of security measures or protections have been put in place regarding the security of this data?
So the databases are housed within the U.S. government. CBP doesn't necessarily keep or own any of those permanent databases. You know, they're owned by Department of State, they're owned by other branches of DHS. We access a lot of that information, we use it, we match against it, and then we put information back into them.
Okay. You know, I continue to have hits come across my desk about the mishaps and disadvantages of facial recognition technology and the racial bias. It's my understanding that the technology continues to misrepresent and irregularly identify people of color and women. So am I hearing from majority of the panel that that is not the case? Because it keeps coming to us. So there has to be some validity.
Sir, in our testing for the one-to-one identification algorithms, we do see evidence of demographic effects, differences with regard to race and sex and age. Okay. In the one-to-many identification testing that we did, for the algorithms that we tested, there was a small set of high-performing algorithms that had undetectable differentials. Okay. But the majority of the algorithms still exhibit those characteristics of.
Let me add, and can you give a description of the difference between the two sets?
Yes, sir. In the case of verification, verifying an identity, a biometric is matched solely, in the case of face recognition, a picture is matched against.
Is that the one-to-one?
That's the one-to-one, that's right. The identification, or the verification is to try to determine if you are who you say you are, and it's based, it's matched against a gallery of one, in essence.
And what's the one-to-many?
And the one-to-many is matched, in the case of CBP's application, 1 to perhaps thousands for the airline public, the traveling public, or 1 to millions in the case of law enforcement such as FBI, to try to identify a suspect.
So you're saying that the percentage of identifications in the one-to-one, you have more incidents of this this bias that we see?
I should clarify, in the algorithms that we tested, that is correct. However, many of the vendors who chose to participate in the one-to-many testing did not choose to participate in the one-to-one.
Okay.
And those are some of the highest performing in the one-to-many.
Okay. Thank you, and I'll yield back, Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, my colleague. Dr. Romaine, I have a question regarding the effectiveness of the technology that you've tested regarding children. Is it a potential, if we assembled a gallery of photographs of children crossing the border, some of whom are being exploited, and false identifications presented, how does the technology work with children as compared to mistakes and errors and other demographics? And can this technology be used to protect children that are perhaps being exploited and crossing our borders, coming into our country? And if so, what can we do to protect the privacy of those children, given the fact that they're minors? And I'll leave you my remaining 30 seconds here.
Thank you, sir. The application specifically is something that we don't test. What we have tested is the effectiveness of the algorithms in terms of error rates. And we do find that for children in the one-to-one setting, the one that you just described, there are demographic effects there. There are differentials. The error rates are higher in the one-to-one case with respect to age. So it's more difficult based on our testing. It appears more difficult to measure.
But there's no gallery there's no one-to-many. There's no gallery of photographs of children.
We have no such gallery.
If we did develop that, then this could test the effectiveness, and perhaps this could be a tool to protect children.
We could undertake many different kinds of testing to determine the effectiveness of those.
Thank you, sir, and I thank my colleague for yielding.
Absolutely. Thank you, Representative Higgins. Mr. Wagner, is it true that a biometric entry-exit system uses less personally identifiable information than the current system that we have in place?
Yes, because currently you open your passport booklet and show it to an individual to either say, check your bags, go through TSA screening, board the plane, a CBP officer. You're exposing your name, your date of birth, your passport number, your place of birth, all the information on your passport page. Somebody could be looking over your shoulder, somebody could take a picture over your shoulder looking at that. You're disclosing it to a person who doesn't actually need to know all of that additional information versus standing in front of a camera with no identifiable information other than your face, which they can already see, and your picture's taken, and on the screen comes a green check mark, and that person now knows you've been validated by the government record to proceed. So you're sharing actually less information in this instance.
So not only sharing less information, but on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, how would you rate that this progress, as you, in your own words, is continuing to develop, and rightfully so, would be the highest security possible for travelers compared to anything else that we're doing now?
Right now, I think on top of everything else we're doing, it brings us closest to 10, where's where we want to be. When
Representative Higgins talked about some of the children involved, are there any numbers or statistics based on people that you have caught either involved in human trafficking or some other nefarious activity strictly because of the facial recognition?
Yeah, on the land border, we've got 247 imposters so far, meaning they had a legitimate document, belonged to somebody else. 18 of those, so 7%, were under the age of 18, so they'd be considered children. 73 of those at the land border had U.S. passports or U.S. passport cards, and 46 of them, or almost 20%, had criminal records that they were trying to hide.
Do you believe that these were identified strictly because of the use of facial recognition, or was there any other aspect or involvement?
Our officers are also very good at identifying the behaviors in the person when they present a travel document. A lot of times that can also be a cue that the person's hiding something. But the technology on top of the officer's skills and abilities should bring us to that security posture that will bring us to near perfect.
Are there any policies difference between a U.S. citizen versus a non-citizen?
Well, everyone has to establish their identity by law. Everyone has to produce some type of identification. Law requires a U.S. citizen to travel on a passport.
And the process scrubbing this 12 hours after is what?
That's our internal policy. If we take a new picture, we discard it after 12 hours. We're looking at actually shrinking that to a less time. We only keep it there in case the system crashes and we got to restore everything.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the young lady from Las Vegas, Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find this interesting. The more you talk, the less I know, it turns out, unfortunately. McCarran Airport is in my district. It's a very busy airport, one of the busiest in the country. A lot of international tourists come through there. So I know we've talked a lot about the use of this facial recognition for security reasons. I'd like to talk about it in terms of how it affects the passenger's experience. We want people in Las Vegas to have a good experience from the time they land to the time they leave. So how do you work to coordinate using this for security and also reducing wait times or serving the passenger as opposed to making it more difficult for the passenger? Mr. Wagner?
So it absolutely supports our travel and tourism goals as well. It makes a much better passenger experience, a more convenient passenger experience, more consistent passenger experience. You think as you go through the airport, the number of stops you have to make to produce a piece of paper or open your passport again or provide some other form of validation to go forward, you can use the facial recognition and the camera to have that same process. And it's quick enough that you walk up, your picture's taken, in 2 to 3 seconds, you're moving forward. So what we're seeing is reduced wait times. The airlines, as they incorporate it into the boarding process, are reducing their boarding times of the aircraft, sometimes as much as, say, 40–45%. It's a different atmosphere for the traveler because you're not fumbling for your documents or forgetting where you put your boarding pass or getting stuck in line behind the person whose phone went dead when they went to read their boarding pass or forgot where they put their passport. So it's creating a better atmosphere for the traveler. It's moving the lines quicker because it's creating, you can't leave your face on the plane. You can't, leave your face in the bathroom. You can't forget that like people do with their travel documents. So it's making an easier process because everybody knows how to take a picture. And what we see is people are enjoying this, this process a lot better for them. And what we're seeing is the lines reduced.
Are you working with TSA or local law enforcement to make this all run smoothly, or is that not necessary?
So we're working very closely with TSA. We've run a few pilots with them. We have an ongoing pilot in Atlanta because we build the gallery before, as the person prints out their boarding pass. So any place now where they have to show their passport at the airport, say when they're departing the U.S., you could take a picture and validate it against our gallery. So you're outside of the airport or you just walked into the airport, you got your boarding pass, your picture goes into that gallery. So steps like checking your bags where you have to show your ID to the airline person. You can have a camera there that does that. You go up to the TSA checkpoint. TSA can take the photograph. It transmits to our gallery, again, because we built it for the biometric exit requirement. But we want to make that environment available to all the other places in the airport where you would show your passport to do that. So, so for TSA, you could take a picture, then you go through screening. You go to board the plane, the airline takes your picture, it comes back to our gallery, we confirm it, you can board the plane without even showing your passport to the airline or showing your boarding pass to the airline.
Well, suppose you find somebody doesn't match. My understanding is this goes through an app, and law enforcement, if they're busy or if the person responsible for checking out the non-match is doing something else. Do you have some kind of staffing model for who's responsible for that? Because I had heard it comes through an app, and since there's no action that you're supposed to take that's very clear, sometimes they just ignore it.
Depending on where you are in the airport, generally it would be the airline or CBP. We would just look at the physical passport, which is what you're presenting now, and we'd make a determination. Now, if we have doubts about do you match the picture on your passport, right, which happens, or if the airline has doubts you match the picture on your passport, they may call us over. We may ask a person for another form of ID. We may ask them additional questions. We may do a further inspection on them. So if you don't look like your passport photo, you know, from a visual review, these are the same kind of things that would occur.
You know, we've been having a lot of confusion about going to the real ID from just regular driver's licenses. People don't know they have to do that. We're trying to get the word out. Some states didn't provide the funding to go to real ID. Is that transition part of your consideration as you develop this new system, or is it not connected?
It's separate than this.
So that it's not going to make any difference.
Not really.
All right, so people who will use their passports instead of real ID, that won't matter.
Right, because these are international travelers we're talking about today, so they would generally have a passport.
You don't see this moving to national as well as international once it's up and
I would
running?
defer to TSA on that for their requirements on how this might apply to a domestic flight.
Okay.
I think there's some good discussion to have there that if people have passports and you could electronically confirm them even on a domestic flight, should the traveler opt into this, I think it'd be good government to build a system like this if that's what people would want.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois. I'm sorry, gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. It's been an interesting hearing to watch. I just want to dispel any misinformation on the facial recognition technology that we're discussing here today. It seems to be abnormally controversial. We're not talking about 1984-style government surveillance, not like China has. We're not talking about facial recognition in the National Mall or Times Square, downtown Houston. We're talking about facial recognition at air, land, and sea ports of entry, where the government has not just the authority, but the duty, the responsibility to know who enters our country, and where they're already checking for identification, of course. It seems from the answers we've gotten that CBP is using the best algorithms with almost no bias whatsoever in them. That's what we've established today, as far as I understand. Locations where facial recognition technology is employed, those locations are marked, correct?
Yes, it's where you would normally present your passport.
Okay. Locations where facial recognition technology is employed are places where entrants are required to present, you've already answered that one, present a form of photographic identification already. Entrants are allowed to opt out of facial recognition technology and present photographic identification to a CBP officer who will then compare the physical appearance of the entrant and the photographic identification presented, correct?
Correct.
Biometric data for U.S. persons is stored for no more than 12 hours in an encrypted virtual private cloud, correct?
Correct.
Biometric data for entrants who are not U.S. persons are stored in ident, correct? And given the above, knowing where facial recognition technology is used, requirement to present photo ID, the ability to opt out, and the secured storage, what are the major privacy concerns I might be missing? How can we improve this?
I think what we've heard from the privacy community is people get used to the convenience of this technology, and that bleeds over into the commercial world or their private sense, and they may be more likely to allow that to happen outside of your, say, government requirements. And, you know, my discussions with them, I said, yeah, but there's also an expectation by the public that they have this convenience in their private life, and why should their interactions with their government be so antiquated?
Yeah.
Why should their travel through the airport be so antiquated and manual and frustrating? And, you know, don't they expect that that same convenience should apply when they're traveling internationally?
One One way this could be used in a very positive sense is to combat human trafficking. Is there a way that tools like this can be integrated with other tools like Spotlight and Safer to battle child sex trafficking, human trafficking?
Sure, because what this helps us do is our core vetting processes are biographically based, right? A name and date of birth is submitted, say, to a watch list, through an airline application, through TSA, and we vet and do those background checks on the basis of say, who the airlines tell us who's flying, so who checked in, who purchased a ticket. Mm-hmm. But when you can then use a biometric to validate that you vetted the right person, you have the assurances that that is the person who's actually traveling and not just their passport is traveling under a different person that's being trafficked. Mm-hmm. So it helps us close those vulnerabilities of imposters for nefarious or being trafficked or being victimized to be able to do that using imposter documents.
Okay. In my limited time left, can this be used to combat visa overstays as well?
Yes, we've actually, we track visa overstays primarily through the biographic information the airline provides, but by implementing this system, we have actually biometrically confirmed almost 44,000 by overstays. With the biometric validation that these people overstayed, they ended up leaving the U.S., albeit later than they were authorized to do so. So, just about 44,000.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Rose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mina, the NYPD has in the past used facial recognition to compare photos from crime scenes against its own internal arrest databases. Some state lawmakers want to take that ability away from the NYPD and other New York State law enforcement agencies. Do you support police agencies using facial recognition in the course of their criminal investigations?
Congressman, that's not necessarily an issue that we've looked at CRCL. We're primarily looking at the DHS uses of facial recognition technology, and in particular, we have focused primarily, as Dr. Romine mentioned, less so on the identification piece where you have sort of this, you're trying to match a photo to a gallery of tons, and we're looking at a much narrower, so we're looking at I think more of the verification, if I understand the technology correctly. And again, our role there is really to make sure that we're addressing these concerns regarding impermissible bias, whether that is, again, based on race, national origin, age, gender, as we've talked about.
So one thing that I think has been absent in this conversation is the ways in which civil liberties can potentially be infringed upon in the absence of the use of technology. Can you speak to this for a minute or two? I'm thinking of false positives. I'm thinking of people who are being arrested or at least questioned further based off of just a verbal description.
Absolutely, Congressman. So I think that it's obviously critically important to blend both the use of technology as well as the end user in this process. I don't think it's an either-or proposition, and as we've advised CBP and other DHS components, that is from a policymaking perspective, that's really where we see the greatest benefit is really that interaction between the technology and the user, because as Mr. Wagner talked about earlier, for example, if there was a false negative, for example, then you would have the line officer or agent looking at their actual passport or their travel documentation and making that independent verification. Sure. And then if it matches, the person goes along and they board the flight.
Right. I think that it's important to note, and so we're all on the same page, that the use of technology has consistently been implemented to preserve our public safety, but also to further protect civil liberties. And this is being lost in this conversation, as yet again, I think we are unnecessarily politicizing an effort to keep us safe. It's not perfect, and you all have some work to do to make it even better. And I'm encouraged to hear that you are making it better. Mr. Wagner, you're going to have to hear from another New Yorker. So, look, I am not a supporter of this New York legislation that was passed. I think it is unfortunate and wrong that you all were not notified. But two wrongs do not make a right. So I'm going to ask you some very simple questions. If you all were setting out to be the professional force that you are and do this professionally, do you think that in advance of announcing this, you should have told Congress what was wrong and what would happen if it was not fixed or addressed?
So I'd have to defer to DHS on that,
No, come on, man. This is ridiculous. That's a simple question. That's a simple question. We heard about this from Fox News. This is politics at its worst. We are talking about acting like professionals right now. If there is a problem that needs to be addressed and you all are doing this, do you think it was appropriate that we were not told well in advance so we can try to arrive at some solution? Do you think that's okay? Is that the way you would want to carry this out?
I'm not going to comment on that. I mean, that's your...
You're not going to carry... So by the fact that you have given very clear and declarative answers previously, I think that we can all assume what you are thinking and unwilling to say right now. So let's commit to actually trying to solve problems here. You got members of Congress that won't be able to renew something. You got more importantly than members of Congress. Who cares about members of Congress? Millions of other people that are now held in the balance. People on my staff, people, colleagues, all types of people. All types of people. This is politics. If you really were making an effort to address a problem, there would have been a system, a proposal, a negotiation, a conversation, letters written. That is the way business is conducted. So let's put that aside. Would you now commit, now that we've all engaged in our politics, to actually having sensible meetings and conversations about a way forward to solve this issue?
Sure, I think that's a good place.
You would commit to that? Okay, thank you.
Gentleman, time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many of my constituents in Northern Illinois have to drive over an hour to get to a major airport in Chicago, and therefore we are always interested in learning more about technologies that can improve airport security wait times. But biometric data is ripe for potential abuse and misuse, which is why it's so important to ensure that DHS uses facial recognition and other technologies in a fair and reliable and effective way. Mr. Wagner, although children under age of 14 are not required to be screened, many do go through screening that collects their biometric information. How does CBP store and secure this information? And I'm talking about under 14.
I think if you're outside the scope of the biometric exit tracking requirement, which is 14 to 79, I believe we discard all of that information. Let me verify that.
Yeah, would you be willing to provide the committee with that information in writing, both the procedure and the policy, in order to do so?
Yes.
Okay. Are there any differences in how CBP collects, uses, or secures children's biometric information in comparison to adults? So if a child presents, does it just take it and immediately delete? Right? Or is it going to be going through some kind of filtering later on? We want that level of information.
You got it.
Okay. December 2019 NIST report found that children are more likely to be misidentified during biometric screening. Of course, we know that other groups, like we've discussed today, people of color, seniors, are also misidentified. Mr. Wagner, what actions is CBP taking to correct the patterns of errors identified in the NIST report?
Well, again, we're using a high-performing algorithm that we're not seeing those demographic-based error rates. Now, if someone does not match to either the gallery or to the document they're presenting, we'll physically examine the document and manually look at the picture, and if we have the confidence it is the person, we could do that through questioning, we could do that through additional forms of identification, we could do that through an inspection of the person. Sometimes someone's just looking at the passport and going, okay, that's you, go ahead. It all depends on how discrepant you look from your travel document photograph.
And some passengers report being unaware or confused about how to opt out of their biometric screening. As CBP expands the biometric screening program, does it intend to reevaluate the best method of communicating the important opt-out information to passengers?
Yeah, so right now we've got signage at the airports, but a lot of people don't read signs at the airport. We've got gate announcements that the airlines try to make as before boarding. But again, there's always competing announcements going on, and sometimes it's tough to understand what's being said. So we're actually looking with the airlines is could we print things on the boarding pass? Could we give notifications when they're, say, booking their ticket or when they're getting their check-in information for boarding? Are there electronic messages we could provide? So
Right.
we're looking at additional ways to do that. We also started taking out some privacy advertisements, advising people of the requirements and what their options are as well, too.
Okay, well, it is certainly my interest in making sure that every passenger understands that, one, this is happening, and two, that they have a choice to opt out. And I would certainly urge CBP to strongly consider and issue this committee a timeline for perhaps outlining how we can improve that communication to all passengers. Does CBP capture and report the rate of false positives or mistaken identifications among different demographics at each port of entry where biometric technology is used?
What we track are the people that we take a photograph of or receive a photograph of and are not able to match it to their travel document that is in our gallery.
Right.
And again, that's that 2 to 3%. Our review of that information does not show noticeable discrepancies on any types
Sir,
of
that wasn't my question. My
demographics.
question is capturing and reporting by port of entry. So we want to know the false positives. Are we seeing more at certain places along the border? Are we seeing more false positives at certain airports?
We're not seeing false positives. That's matching you to a different identity. We're not seeing that with this technology.
Or mistaken identities?
We're not seeing that. We're more likely you don't match against anything, so we get a no information return.
Okay. Dr. Rami, can you elaborate on what NIST recommends to algorithm developers to improve accuracy across demographics?
The testing that we do does not result in recommendations specifically to the vendors other than to take the data that we provide, the evaluation results, and strive to use those results to improve their methods. But
So you're saying that you don't have a lot of interaction with the developers?
we have informal interaction with them in the sense that we are, the scientists who do this biometric testing are part of a larger biometrics community. We see the vendor representatives, the scientists at meetings and so on. But with regard to the FRVT itself, the testing, the feedback that we provide to the vendors is the test results.
Okay, so you all aren't doing like convenings with industry and helping them improve the quality of their product?
We do host events, but more as a convener to get the community together to discuss different techniques. But we don't provide, other than sort of in the general scientific community sense, we don't provide specific recommendations for their improvement.
Okay, I recognize my time's expired. We would just like to get more information about that in writing, and we'll submit
happy
a
to do
question.
that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the young lady from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. A couple of questions. I think I just want to talk more about the role of CRCL in this. It seems to me that there's not been much coordination across the DHS spectrum on directions from DHS to each component regarding their deployment of biometric technologies. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Is there any sort of department-wide strategy in place for the use of biometric technologies, or are components like yours given wide latitude to stand up biometric programs as you please?
I'm sorry, what?
Are you a lone ranger?
Are we what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Okay. Doesn't seem that there's coordination, doesn't seem like there's this sort of department-wide oversight. I want to know whether or not you're getting directions from others, because then I'm going to ask Mr. Minna, what is your role, and to what degree have you been involved in the oversight and in signing off on how these things are being done?
Yeah, so as we build out new programs, we're bound by certain statutes that require us to publish, say, your systems of record notice, your privacy impact assessment, where things are reviewed by our internal counsel or our privacy officer, and to make sure we make and meet all the requirements of the statute. Do you have the authority to collect what you're doing? Is your timeline for storing it and sharing it, is that all permissible in law? Is it consistent with your mission? Are you authorized to do those things?
So are you operating within your sort of silo? This is what the law says with regard to what you can do. Is this how you execute based upon what your interpretation is of that? Or is there a DHS component that plays into this as well and says, okay, but this is how we want to see this?
Well, depending on the acquisition process, there's a multitude of people at DHS that look at the acquisition, the resources spent. There's a whole process to go through for approval before various boards that authorize the expenditures and the investment in that. There's the DHS privacy officer, there's DHS counsel, so there's a lot of oversight by DHS already in this process. Certainly the rulemakings would go through DHS counsel, the DHS policy, so there is a lot of oversight and coordination.
It's my understanding, though, that there is no centralized body within a department that gives the program a stamp of approval or certifies that they're ready for prime time. Is that correct? Has CRCL approved your program? Do you know?
No, they wouldn't necessarily go to them for approval, but there is...
Well, approval in the sense of maintaining and protecting privacy rights.
So things are reviewed by them, and I'll defer to my colleague.
What authority do you have, sir? Just a minute.
Why don't I answer that in a couple different ways, Congresswoman? So let me step back a second and talk a little bit about the first part of your question regarding sort of the enterprise level review. I think one of the ways in which CRCL participates in that dialogue is by serving on enterprise level wide working groups across the department that include representatives from CBP and DHS S&T and the Office of Biometric Identity Management, where we actually are talking about a lot of these issues. Now, we don't have a privacy impact assessment type model. However, we do work very closely with the Privacy Office regarding not just facial recognition technology, but certainly other forms of biometric identification that the department uses. Now, with regard to our relationship with CBP, we work with them in a couple different ways. First is very directly in terms of offering them advice, and then also we go on site visits and we also work with CBP and the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board in their engagement as well. So
is your role anything more than just advice, observation and advice? You have no authority to say, no, that's not working, that's a violation, no, that's it, right? Advice?
That's not entirely accurate. What I would say is, yes, we do have an advisory capacity. We also have a compliance function where we do offer recommendations to components based on investigation.
And if they don't follow them?
Then we can elevate it if necessary.
Okay, I have one last question.
Yes.
The question has to do with just the whole system that is used when we're taking pictures and, who's in charge of determining whether or not the lighting is good, the background is adequate, the cameras are good, they're placed right, so that we can get the best pictures that we need to get? Is there anyone in charge of that?
CBP would be, and that's going to be based on, our results of, say, the match rates. And, you can have an airport with a bank of booths, and the windows is such that the sunlight comes in and affects these booths during the morning and these booths in the afternoon. And those are the things we've got to look at as we deploy this. What are the environmental factors that are going to influence all the different locations that we're going to do this? And then we try to adjust. And that might mean we have the airport tint the windows.
How do you do that?
We do that internally by reviewing the data and the results of what happens.
On what kind of a basis? Weekly, daily, monthly, whatever?
All of it.
You know what time the sun comes in that window, you know what time the sun comes in that window.
Right.
That's just,
I would say we do it continuously to get the best production we can out of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a unanimous consent request that 2 articles on this topic be admitted for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you,
So
sir.
ordered. Chair recognizes the young lady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the chairman very much, and let me acknowledge all of the government witnesses and thank them for their service. Let me renew the inquiry that will be pursued by Chairwoman Rice, but I will add to it, and that is, Mr. Wagner, a better understanding, maybe you'll provide the information to the committee on the denial of clear, global, and trusted traveler as it relates to states that may not have the laws that you think are appropriate, or in the instance of New York, closing out access to the issue of driver's license. And I raise the question because we should look as a federal government as what other identification options may be valid. And I know that we've known each other for a long time. I would think that you'd be willing to look at that so that we can find common ground. Let me pursue this line of reasoning. And please, witnesses, understand that I am not saying this is what you are doing. I need to understand your thinking. So to the Deputy Executive Assistant Commissioner Wagner, would you accept the fact that bias could be introduced by technology if the application developer of the programs have a bias into how an application reacts to different types of people, because it's technology?
Yes.
And I would also make the point, though it's a little bit humorous, is I'm sure the people in Iowa were trusting of the app and thought they had something going on there, and we all can see where we are at this point. Would you accept that, Mr. Amina?
Yes, Congressman.
And would NIST accept that, Mr. Ramin?
Yes.
Yes. And an algorithm could be, again, know that this is not pointed toward you, be written to flag all black males wearing dreadlocks. Mr. Wagner? This is in terms of how technology can be.
I guess you could.
I understand. You can say on the record, to your knowledge, you're not using that kind of algorithm.
You're not using that.
That would be very good. I'm sure dreadlock wearers would be glad of that. Mr. Mina?
Yes, that is possible. And again, as Mr. Wagner said, we have not seen that in our review as well.
All right, Mr. Ramin.
It's certainly possible.
Okay, so here we are. Let me, to my colleagues over here that are DNA advocates, as a member of the Judiciary Committee, which I had to step away from, we are DNA lovers. I wrote the Violence Against Women Act and put in $291 million for DNA enhancement. So we understand that the new added technology, but as the Department of Homeland Security, we made a commitment post 9/11 with George Bush going to the trade and saying he heard the firefighters, but at the same time, he also heard Muslims who were indicating it's not the blanket world of people who happen to be Muslim. So in particular, Mr. Mina, I want to try to find out what aggressive role do you play in helping to not have platitudes, forgive me, I'm not suggesting you do, but to aggressively ensure that the biases against black women with dreadlocks, men with dreadlocks, Muslims, sheiks wearing attire. We went through that. I've been on this committee since its beginning. That's not technology, and then now sophisticated technology is not undermining the civil liberties and civil rights of this nation and those coming in innocently to the country. You can use the new technology as well. And then to Mr. Ramin, let me find out, how are you continuing to do your assessment of these algorithms to ensure that it looks like you were not able to get the exact one that Mr. Wagner's team is using? That concerns me. I need you to get every accurate piece of information, and I'd like you to say that, Mr. Mina. What aggressiveness are you doing to protect the travelers and the American people?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. So I think we're doing a lot of different things across the spectrum and the life cycle of this program and policy. And again, I want to focus, our attention is really on the application, not so much on the algorithm itself, but on how it's applied by a particular DHS program, in this case, CBP. We do that through, on the policymaking side, working directly with the component, advising on proposed regulations, implementing policies, as well as offering suggestions as it relates to application. For example, folks wearing religious headwear, or folks that have objections to photography based on religious reasons, or the people who are disabled or otherwise injured and aren't able to take pictures. We also do it through our robust community engagement. We talk to members of the community across the country. And Mr. Chairman, I actually have the information in front of me regarding some of the areas. The issue's been raised in Portland, in Atlanta, in Chicago, and Seattle, and then also to a lesser extent in Southern California, primarily LA and Orange County, and then by New York City area stakeholders, where we've heard concerns regarding facial recognition technology. And one of our primary roles is to be the eyes and ears of the department, and we inform our colleagues at CBP, at DHS S&T, at OBIM. Here are the concerns that we're seeing. How do we work together to try and address some of these problems or potential problems before they have even greater effect? And then also, too, on the back end, we have a robust compliance process. And while we don't have an active investigation right now on facial recognition, that's always something that we're looking at. If we see a trend, we'll most certainly open an investigation and again advise in that way as well.
Would you be kind enough, Mr. Chairman, let Mr. Ramin answer this question? And as he answers, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say this on the record, if that we can get answers from Mr. Wagner about what is stored in terms of retaining information.
Ms. Jackson, Ms. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr.
Now, Dr. Ramin, you can answer the question. You can submit in writing to
no,
Mr.
that's what I'm
Wagner.
saying. Yes.
Yes,
Thank you,
please,
sir.
happy to do it.
Thank you. Mr. Ramin, my question was,
I beg your pardon, ma'am.
yeah, okay. My question was, what are you doing to be accurate in your testing? You said you didn't know whether you had the accurate app that they were using. What are you doing to be aggressive in making sure that we don't have the bias in these
Yes, ma'am.
algorithms?
The tests that we undertake are intended to determine whether there are demographic differences, commonly called bias. The fact that I know there's strong interest in testing with data that is more representative, and we've signed a recent MOU with the CBP to undertake continued testing to make sure that we're doing the very best that we can to provide the information that they need to make sound decisions.
Thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for appearing as well. And I would like to address some intelligence that has been afforded me. The indication is that NIST found that Asian and African American faces were 10 times more likely, 10 to 100 times more likely to be misidentified than white faces. And I'm curious as to whether or not there is something inherent in the technology that creates an inverse relationship with reference to the identification of whites juxtaposed to African Americans and Asians. Is there something inherent in the technology, meaning if you want to absolutely identify whites, will there be something that you cannot adjust such that you will get the same absolute identification with minorities, Asians, African Americans? Or if you want to absolutely identify African Americans and Asians, will you, as a result of technology, not be able to properly identify whites? Would you
Very interesting question,
Thank you.
Congressman. And let me clarify first that those differentials that we observed were not in the case of identification, but rather verification, the one-to-one testing rather than the one-to-many testing in general. We saw those demographic differences for African American and for Pacific Islanders and Asians as well. But in the case that you're talking about, our work has not to date focused on cause and effect. What is it that's causing the algorithms to exhibit certain kinds of behavior? We're really just testing the performance. So I don't know the answer to your question.
My question was interesting as you put it. Your answer is intriguing because this is not the first opportunity for the word to be heard that we have these difficulties. And at some point, it would seem that we would move from testing technology as it is to understanding why technology performs the way it does. help me to understand why we haven't made that move.
The question that you asked is a very challenging open research question, but we do have some indications. There are algorithms that have been submitted to our testing from Asian countries that do not exhibit the demographic differentials on Asian faces. So we can't guarantee, but we think that's an indication that the training data that are being used for the algorithm development may have a significant impact on their ability to discern or exhibit demographic differences for different populations.
Do you believe that it's important for us to move expeditiously to answer this question, to resolve this issue, such that we don't find ourselves having deployed something in mass that we know to be defective or have some degree of inefficiencies associated with it? The efficacy of this is important.
Yes, sir, and I think those are two different things to think about. The performance testing that we currently execute can help operational agencies ensure that they are not deploying things that exhibit different demographic differentials. The research question that you teed up that's fascinating about what are the causes of these demographic differentials is a much deeper question and much more difficult, I think.
Well, is it fair to say that the countries, and I have about 45 seconds left, but the countries that employ the technology that have indicated to you they're having fewer challenges, is it fair to say that that technology also captures white men sufficiently?
In the testing that we did for the specific one that I'm referring to, the high-performing algorithms from Asian countries that don't exhibit the demographic differences on Asians, it's in comparison to Caucasian faces that I make that statement. So there's no difference in the performance or no discernible difference in the performance on Caucasian faces and Asian faces from certain Asian-developed algorithms. And one speculation is that it may be the training data that are used.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair, recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island for 5 minutes. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony here today, and thank you for what you're doing, your dedication to this issue, a very important issue. I certainly believe that technology is an important part of the solution set to some of our most vexing issues and challenges, including how to manage an ever-growing number of international travelers. So I think it's been a good discussion here today. What I wanted to ask for Mr. Wagner or Mr. Mina, we know that in technological solutions such as facial recognition software, the algorithms are only as good as the data that inform them. So I want to know, how has CBP adjusted or augmented the data that it uses to train its facial recognition software? And what are you doing to ensure the software is continually updated as more robust data sets and algorithms are incorporated into training?
So that's where we work closely with the vendor whose algorithm we're using, NEC, and we work closely with them to incorporate their updates and their latest and greatest products into how we're using them. And then as we review the data, we look to make those operational adjustments, which do impact match rates. And again, that's going to be the quality of the photograph, the quality of the camera, the human factors. The size of the gallery is really important. And, NIST tested galleries up to, I think, 12 million people. On the margins of the capabilities of these algorithms, we're doing this against a couple of thousand. And interesting correlations are how much better improved is your match rates and what's the impact on any potential demographic biases on a much smaller gallery or sample size. And I think that's what we were getting at earlier, that what are these variables that we can rise or lower to help address some of what the error rates are showing us.
So, okay, to that point then, how does CBP incorporate feedback from officers about errors that facial recognition software is made in the field, because the machine, it learns, and if that, when the officer is looking and interacting with someone and the software doesn't get it correct, unless that feedback is fed back into the system doesn't learn.
Oh, absolutely, and that's where we look at, we look at the system logs themselves, but we also talk to the officers, they provide the feedback, and then we're also on site to witness and observe and discuss with those officers as we deploy these.
It's important. So I understand the Trusted Traveler Program shares information with other countries. And how does CBP share biometric information with other countries, and what steps does it take to ensure that those countries use the data responsibly? Is that accurate, number one, what my understanding is, and how are we guarding that data and making sure that they're protecting it?
I'm trying to think of when, I'm not aware of how we would share, or if we're even sharing.
Well, the Trusted Traveler Program.
We don't share, we might share a person's status that they're approved in the program, but we're not actually sharing, say, their fingerprints.
Okay, so let me ask that one for the record, and I'd ask that you get back to the committee
yes.
on that. This is important. What types of information do we share under the Trusted Traveler Program? And I think that's important for us to know. And if we do share whatever information we share, I want to know what steps we take to ensure that those countries use that data responsibly. Okay. So I'm going to go to, I know that this question has been touched on earlier, so I'm going to ask it perhaps in a different way, but just prior to our hearing on this topic, last July, we were notified of a cyber incident on the network of a CBP subcontractor. Someone claiming to be a foreign agent gained access to tens of thousands of photos of drivers' faces and license plates at a port of entry along the southern border. How is CBP ensuring that the personal data it collects for facial recognition technology screening programs, whether by the government directly or by vendors or other private sector partners, are being protected from inadvertent or otherwise unauthorized access? And also, what assurances can you give our committee that the root causes of the May 2019 breach have been addressed so as to reduce the likelihood of another breach?
So the airlines and airports that provide the cameras that take the pictures, that transmit them to CBP, we have a signed set of business requirements with them, which they commit to not storing, not sharing, not saving any of the photographs that they take. They take the picture, have to transmit it to us, and purge it from their system. One of the other conditions is that they have to be available for CBP to audit their cameras and their technology to ensure that they are following those rules. We're about to commence an audit on one of the airlines in the next couple of months and start that process to do that, but to make sure that that's not happening.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I would ask that Mr. Wagner get back to the committee in writing as soon as possible on that Trusted Traveler Program and what information is shared with partners.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Young lady from Texas want to ask her a question since everybody else had asked there.
Chairman, thank you so very much. First of all, I'll ask unanimous consent to place in the record, not to the witnesses, but the headline reads, Amazon facial recognition mistakenly confused 28 congressmen with known criminals, July 26, 2018. So, Mr. Wagner, I just want to use, are you using the Amazon technology?
We are not using their matching algorithm.
So, and you gave, thank you, Mr. Chairman, my question is, you gave Mr. Congressman Langevin sort of a detailed response, so let me try to change it around to, do you have a team that is directly responsible not just for the implementation, but for the internal analysis of the utilization of the app or the technology that you're using so that it is on site, so you're able to get firsthand knowledge of the violations or, let me use the word abuses, by way of the technology? Is that information coming back to your office? When I say that, to your sector?
Yes, part of it's our office that does it, and then working in conjunction with our field locations.
And, well, just So do you have a team that's just responding to that, if you
We have
would?
teams that review the data, review the reports, review the functioning of the systems, review the compliance of the officers using the technology, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just say this. I know we have a lot of work, you have a lot of work, you do a lot, but maybe there can be a classified briefing. I'd like to do a deeper dive on how that is done and how that is kept, and whether they store, how long they keep the data on Mr. Jones or Mr. Amon and Mr. Various named persons, how long they keep the data.
We'll work through it.
The data is all stored in compliance with the systems of record notices of where that data is stored. So the photograph of a U.S. citizen that we take is only stored for 12 hours and then purged. A picture of a foreign national is sent over to IDENT, the department's database, where it's stored for 75 years. The record of the border crossing, the biographical information, is then stored in other systems and attributable to the systems of record notices attributable to those.
Very interesting. Thank
We'll
you.
follow up
Provide
on
that.
your
Mr. Chairman.
request.
Thank you, witnesses. Thank you.
Let me insert in the record a letter from the Electronic Privacy Information Center and a press release from the U.S. Travel Association. Mr. Wagner, if you are aware of any notification requirements that a state would be noticed. I'm talking about the global entry situation, because it looks like New York is just the first of one or two others. Since we've been sitting here, Mr. Cuccinelli has said Washington State might be in a similar position. And I'm just wanting to make sure that if this is the way forward, then surely, in light of what Mr. Rose and some of the other New Yorkers on this committee have said, there should be some notice that this is about to happen and not just a press conference. So I think that if you're aware of any, please get it back to us in the committee. We'd love to have it. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objections, the committee record will be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the committee stands adjourned.
So what did you guys think about that? Let me know in the chat or in the comments. I'm sorry I couldn't chat a bunch. Thank you for joining. Let's see, who do we have? I know we had Bo. I'm sorry I couldn't say hi. Hi, Bo. How are you? And thank you for joining Brenda as well. You guys are awesome. I've been having a lot of technical issues. I'm sure you guys saw how horrible the quality was for the stream. So I'm sorry about that, but thank you for sticking with me. You know, facial recognition is something that we see repeatedly them trying to extend. If you haven't seen the previous hearing that we streamed on facial recognition, then go ahead and go back and watch it, because they talked a lot about the issues in facial recognition in that hearing. Now, what's interesting is the people on the witness stand, I forget their names, I'm sorry, I'm bad about that, but the people giving the testimonies, the witnesses, they were saying repeatedly that, you know, the highest ranking algorithms we don't see any significant issues with. And then when they were asked, well, are you using these high ranking algorithms? Oh, well, we cannot independently verify that, you know, all of our organizations, that we're all using the same algorithms that are high ranking. So they're wanting to, you know, make it seem like this is something that we're doing and there's not a significant fault in it. But they had to admit multiple times that they were not actually testing the algorithms that are being used. So how does that make any sense? And it was very funny that right at the end, they were like, oh yeah, well, the algorithms that are produced in Asian countries, we think it has something to do with the data sets and the training programs. Well, you think that those might be more accurate? Like if they're getting a more Asian faces, they're going to be more accurate with that demographic. So that's something very logical. I'm not some kind of software engineer, and why are they not going ahead and making sure that they have worked out all of the kinks before they subject American citizens to this just all the time? And in the previous hearing, you will also hear that most representatives, like these are people that travel all the time, they know what's going on with the laws, they know what our government's doing, and even they are like, okay, so how would I opt out of this facial recognition thing when I'm at the airport? How does that even work? And they say that they're trying to notify people about privacy policy and stuff like that. Do people read those? No, they know that they don't read them. So, it's just very telling. And if you missed the stream on the Super Bowl, I did cover how CBP was actually very heavily involved. CBP and ICE were heavily involved with the Super Bowl and security. They set up a whole bunch of 5G stuff from Verizon and T-Mobile and everything. They implemented permanent 5G structures in Miami and in the area, and then they were talking about how they were going to be tracking people so that way they could try to combat human trafficking and everything, and how all of these different branches of law enforcement, the local and then CBP and the state law enforcement, all of these different branches that were involved at the Super Bowl, they all had to communicate instantaneously all of the information, who was going into the place, who was going out of the place, all of the different vehicles and everything that they were tracking. They had to communicate all of it instantaneously. So they were depending on that 5G technology and having cameras everywhere. They even had these gigantic x-ray machines set up. So we're seeing them trying to test this stuff on the public, and that's how they're able to figure out, if algorithms are working or not. And one of them even said that, they're using the points of entry, and they're using other kinds of actual law enforcement, and then he said, and experimental systems as well. Those experimental systems are things like the Super Bowl. They're trying to figure out if their system works, if they can track individual people in a large crowd accurately. That's what they're trying to figure out. So and again, if you missed the facial recognition previous stream, they had a report that was attached to that hearing. And in that report, they described how facial recognition is actually not that accurate because, of course, if you have something on your face, a prosthetic, you could have, a prosthetic nose, and then it's going to identify you as a different person. You could, theoretically, while their algorithms are still getting the kinks worked out, you could put on makeup that is much darker, and it's harder for the algorithm to be able to figure out the dimensions and the depth of your face, and that's how it recognizes things. So with the issues that they have regarding that, it's not accurate. Is my stream working? I'm seeing it buffer a whole bunch. I don't think it's working. Oh well, I forget where I was going with that anyway. Oh yeah, no, I remember. So it's not very accurate. Okay, so they want to instead start testing on scanning people's irises. They talked in that report about how scanning the iris, you can identify even twins, like which twin is which. So it's way more accurate than facial recognition. Obviously, with facial recognition, an algorithm is gonna pin one twin as the other person, but if you're scanning people's eyeballs, then it's not. So welcome to the Minority Report future, you guys. Yay, fun for everyone. All right, and Brenda wanted to let everybody know about the large groups of migrants that are coming up from El Salvador and that region, and that, yeah, they have, there are a few groups, from my understanding, as she said, that are coming up again, just as what happened before. We did do a stream on that situation as well. I think I mentioned that already. But go ahead and check that out if you haven't seen that. Oddly enough, while our government is acting like they're so concerned about the influx of migration and everything, at the same time, they're not doing the very simple job of filling out a date and time for a court hearing, meaning that the people, the immigrants and stuff that are getting these court hearings saying, hey, you entered the country illegally, or your visa is up, or whatever, you need to come to court, you know, they are now able to sue our government for not notifying them when their court hearing is supposed to be. And so because of that, they have had to extend temporary protected status for a whole bunch of countries. So like people that were going to have their papers revoked like last year are getting to go until like the end of 2020 and 2021 in the TPS status just because our government is not doing their job correctly. Yay! So go ahead and watch that if you haven't seen it. And I guess I'm going to go ahead and end this here. There is another hearing that I want to stream, but I don't think I'm going to be able to. It's really stormy outside here. That's why the internet's been really crazy today. I'll see if I can get it to work. Hopefully I can. So go ahead and subscribe if you're not already and turn on bell notifications. And go ahead and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at GrowTheInfo is our handle. And on the website growtheinfo.com you can find all kinds of good resources and information for you to dive into. All right, let's go out with a tune, you guys. And let me know what you guys think about the whole facial recognition thing. Like, do you think, as far as within the country, I know the facial recognition for people like coming outside the, country and into it, a lot of people are in favor of that because we can catch terrorists and stuff that way. But what do you guys think about tracking like American citizens? Let me know what you think about that. Leave a comment down below. Thank you, watchers and replayers. I love you all, and have a wonderful day, everybody.